and in terms of empire's legacy to individuals and communities all over the world now. And I think this is very much an evidence in the book, in the history book aimed at children that she'll be talking about today. Here are voices, a powerful retelling of the British Empire through 20 true stories, which has just come out with Quarto Books just yesterday. So yeah, please welcome Professor Natarajan to ASU today.
Is this microphone on? Yeah. Thank you so much for coming out today to what is, in a sense, my book party. I'm so happy to be here celebrating this book with you all. But more than celebrating the book, I'm here to talk with you about writing history for children and why I believe this is a really important act of public scholarship that all historians should take seriously. But first, I'd like to share a few thank yous. First, to Toby Harper for inviting me to campus, and everyone in the School of Historical, Philosophical, and Religious Studies for hosting me today, especially Yvonne Delgado and Becky Sang for coordinating this visit, and to Monica and your wonderful students today for the amazing conversation that we've had. I'm particularly pleased to be having this talk with you in the library, which I bet all of us are here because we love books and we love libraries. And so thank you so much to the library staff for organizing this event and for hosting us today. Books are portals to other worlds, and libraries give us access to the past, to different people's experiences of the present, and they let us imagine different futures. Today in the United States, access to books and the stories they hold is endangered. The American Library Association reported that the number of challenges to books doubled from 2021 to 2022. Book bans are unpopular across the political spectrum, and 70% of parents oppose them. But small numbers of political organizations are driving the conversation about what books are appropriate to have in libraries and in schools. The Washington Post that reported that 60% of challenges to books in school libraries came from just 11 adults. And state legislatures across the country are criminalizing discussion of race and sexuality by creating burdensome processes to evaluate the contents of books and limiting the range of stories that school and public libraries can share with their readers. Book bans overwhelmingly target material related to gender, sexuality, race, and coloniality. Those who demand particular books be taken out of circulation ask that no one be allowed to read them in the name of protecting children's innocence. And innocence is a word that you'll hear a lot by people who are pressing for banning certain books. Only people who benefit from dominant structures of gender, sexuality, colonialism, and race can afford to protect the innocence of children. For parents of color, Indigenous parents, queer families, turning away from history and politics is not an option. For historians, we should recognize that these book bans are part of a wider battle for how the past should be told and whose histories are worth remembering. In elementary, middle, and high schools, histories that might cause discomfort are being censored. The opportunity to write Here Are Voices, it provided me a vehicle for translating the methodologies and approaches of my scholarly discipline, specifically imperial histories written from post-colonial perspectives, to craft a historical narrative that presents cutting-edge research. I felt it was an opportunity to rewrite the history of the British Empire, one that included racism, colonialism, and patriarchy. And it also was an opportunity to bring into representation a new set of historical figures who were not often seen in books for adults, let alone books for children. It was a chance for me to disrupt what theorist Stuart Hall called cheering fictions, positive images of people of color that present virtuous survival in the face of adversity. It was a chance to refuse to present history from within the frame of ethnicity as it's marshaled by the nation state in service of liberal multiculturalism. But was all this possible to do in a book for children? Today, I want to share with you my journey to publication of Hear Our Voices and consider with you the possibilities of writing children's books as a form of public scholarship, a way of engaging histories of dispossession of violence, and also histories of struggle and solidarity. These public battles over the past show us that what is taught in the classroom and discussed in homes is a crucial site for securing justice in the present. And so I've forgotten my clicker over here. There we go. The story of Hear Our Voices, it starts in the summer of 2020. On June 7, 2020, Black Lives Matter protesters in Bristol, England, pulled down a statue of Edward Colston. A protester placed his knee on Colston's neck for 8 minutes and 46 seconds, and the entire crowd took a knee in memory of George Floyd, who was killed by Minneapolis police officer Derek Chauvin 2 weeks before on May 25th. Then the crowd rolled the statue to Bristol Harbor and threw the statue into the water. In the United States, Black Lives Matter focused public attention on police brutality and state violence. In Portland, where I live, and throughout the country, thousands came together to protest the lack of police oversight and accountability of police departments and broader systems of racial injustice in the country. In Bristol, protesters demanded that the wider public acknowledge and repair the ongoing legacies of empire. Who was Edward Colston, and why did protesters focus on his statue? Edward Colston was born in Bristol in 1636. He joined his family's trading business and expanded it by joining the Royal African Company, which held the exclusive monopoly in transporting enslaved Africans for sale in the Americas. During his time with the Royal African Company, Colston oversaw the purchase, transport, and sale of 89,000 enslaved Africans. On his death in 1712, he gave part of his fortune to construct schools, poorhouses, and other philanthropic institutions in Bristol. His history as one of the architects of the transatlantic slave trade was forgotten, and Bristolians remembered his gifts to the city. The statue was dedicated to one of the most virtuous and wise sons of the city. Black Bristolians claimed that when the statue was removed, they felt a sense of relief, that rather than a whitewashed history of Colston celebrated by the city, that a true history of Bristol could now be told. In demanding acknowledgement of empire, protesters challenge imperial amnesia, which ignores Britain's history of empire, claims that empire happened beyond Britain's borders, but not within Britain itself, or that colonialism was not as bad as its critics claim, that in a cost-benefit analysis, the British Empire did more good than harm. In the history of Colston's statue, we can see how imperial amnesia operates and what might be at stake in demanding a true history of Britain. The protesters critically reappropriated the actions of enslavers by throwing Colston into the water, and in doing so brought together the histories of Bristol and of slavery that had been sundered by this selective public history. The battle over Colston and British history shows that our grasp of the past is selective and incomplete, and depends upon those who have the power and will to give authority and credence to certain stories over others. In the wake of the summer of 2020, many in Britain called for truer histories of Britain's past, and the publisher Wide-Eyed Editions saw an opportunity. Wide-Eyed Editions is a division of Quarto Press, and they are based in the United Kingdom. They saw that there were few books written for children about the British Empire. This hadn't always been the case. In the early 20th century, H.E. Marshall's Our Empire Story and history textbooks like it were written to inspire patriotism among a generation of young working class Britons. And they did so in service of empire. Our empire story is organized around the heroes of empire, Clive of India, Captain Cook, and their adventures unfolded in a story of imperial progress and expansion that inevitably led to Britain's greatness in the present, that is, in H.E. Marshall's present. While imperial heroes are celebrated for their character traits and service to the empire, people of color are presented in this book as racist caricatures and obstacles to Britain's imperial progress. In imperial imagery from the late 19th century, colonial subjects are included in imperial scenes, but they're portrayed as subordinate to the British. This is a sketch by Robert Taylor Pritchard from 1886, and it depicts performers who were part of the colonial and Indian exhibition traveling to Windsor to meet Queen Victoria. You can see that this is an image of diversity. The people are present in their national costumes. They present a colorful display. But when we think about how this diversity is represented, it's represented in subordination to the queen. The person at the front of the line is bowing in front of the Queen Empress. And so this is just an image I wanted to show you to point out that diversity does not mean equity, and that inclusion can happen on unequitable terms. When I was contacted about the opportunity to write a history of the British Empire for children, I knew I did not want to participate in writing a book that presented a cheering fiction of inclusion that didn't account for violence and dispossession. The editors at Wide-Eyed Editions already had a vision for the project, a history of the British Empire for middle grade readers, that is children 9 to 12 years old, that would be fully illustrated and organized around 25 biographies. They were known for biography anthologies that were beautifully illustrated and that celebrated individuals and inspired children. So this language on the right is taken from some of their marketing books for some of their most popular titles, which you may have seen before. They already had Alexander Mostov committed to illustrate the project, and they had first reached out to Kenyan digital heritage specialist Chow Tayana, who said she was interested in writing biographies of Africans to be included in the book, but wouldn't be interested in writing the entire history. When they approached me, I wasn't sure if I should say yes. This would take time away from my academic writing projects. I wasn't sure if my academic peers would respect me for writing a children's history. And I knew that even if it was organized around biographies, a history of the British Empire was very different than these other collections of biographies because it wasn't organized around a national story and it wasn't organized around a category of identity. I was also aware of the very great responsibility of writing a history of violence and dispossession for children. The scholar of African-American children's literature, Rudine Sims Bishop, has identified 5 ways that books should serve young Black readers. And I think we can think about Bishop's points more generally for children of color and Indigenous children who do not see themselves represented in children's literature. I was unsure if I would be able to write an honest history that was also age appropriate and affirmed the humanity of children of color and Indigenous children who would read the book. Ultimately, I said yes. I knew that if I was going to write a history of the British Empire, I would be working in a new mode of writing for children, and I wanted to produce a history of the British Empire that was anti-imperial. But as I read more scholarship about children's literature, I came to see the longer history of the politics of writing for children. Communities of color have long recognized the importance of providing their children with reading material that affirms their identity, narrates their histories, and recognizes the ways that racism and colonialism shapes their lives. For instance, I learned about W.E.B. Du Bois, who in the early 20th century celebrated Black children in his magazine, The Crisis. And in the 1960s and 70s, Black power movements in the United States and in Britain fostered the creation of supplementary schools movements for children, and Black publishers produced books of African and Caribbean folk tales that lifted up the voices of Black children. Despite a groundbreaking essay in 1965 and constant comment regarding the whiteness of children's literature, little seemed to have changed despite all of these efforts. 2013 is considered a groundbreaking year in children's publishing. In that year, the Cooperative Children's Book Center at the University of Wisconsin released their annual figures regarding diversity in children's publishing. Of the 3,200 review copies that they received that year, only 94 featured Black figures and characters. This represented a total of 2.9% of the books they received. Together, BIPOC authors wrote only 7% of the total books received that year. This was a sort of watershed moment, which was made possible by social media. The publication of the study prompted opinion essays in the New York Times and the launch of a social media campaign, #WeNeedDiverseBooks. The Cooperative Children's Book Center shows a steady growth of books featuring characters of color, and yet, as Noreen Nassim Rodriguez and Amanda E. Vickery argue, diversity does not necessarily mean histories that acknowledge racism, affirm identity, and bear witness to struggles for, quote, freedom, equality, and dignity. Scholars of children's literature have put pressure on the simplification of history presented to children. And in doing so, they argue for the relationship between historical narratives in children's book and children's experiences in the present. Too often, however, they reproduce the nation state as the arbiter of belonging and affirmation. Could a children's book rewrite the history of the British Empire to humanize those whose humanity has been in question, to refuse the narrow vision of inclusion offered by the nation state? That's what we set out to do in Hear Our Voices. And for me, the cover of the book really represents our ambitions for the book. On the left, you can see Walter Crane's 1886 Imperial Federation map. And at the center of this image is Britannia. And all of the routes that connect the different parts of the empire are tangled around her trident. All of the figures who we might imagine to be to populate the empire are presented in the frame of the image, and they're reduced to stereotypical caricatures of people we might expect to see in these different lands brought together in empire. These figures are there as racist and exotic decoration for the map, which is really the center of the image. On the right is the cover of Hear Our Voices, which is illustrated by Alexander Mostov. And what Alexander did was bring figures from outside of the frame and to present them as the center of the story. And instead of caricatures, we see real historical figures whose presentation is rooted in historical. And together, these different people who experienced colonialism and imperialism in different places and at different times is one way that we can lift up the voices of individuals without reducing their stories to simplistic inclusion in the narrative of empire. So over 2 years that I spent writing this book, I started in the summer of 2021, and it's just come out yesterday. I realized that I needed to educate my editors. They wanted a book originally that was organized geographically. There would be a North American section, a Caribbean section, an African section, a South Asian section, an East Asian section, and an Oceania. Did we decide how to pronounce Oceania? Oceania? Either. Okay, Oceania, we know what we're talking about. They wanted to show, the editors wanted to show the multiple ways that Britons were motivated to pursue empire. And they wanted to include with those voices of people who made empire, who built empire, people who experienced colonialism and those who fought imperialism. All of these figures would come together in the book they imagined. It would include imperialists, men like Colston, Clive, and Cook, and also colonial subjects. The publishers also insisted that the profiles of individual figures would be written in the first person. And the idea of writing in the first person was the most difficult writing challenge of the book. I'm a scholarly historian. We write in the third person. You probably have all been told that you're not supposed to use I in your writing. I now had to take on the responsibility of writing 20 different I's. And so when I was thinking about the figures we would include in the book, I wanted to choose people who had left memoirs, who had told their own story. And so that I knew when I was writing my version of their story, I was drawing on their words. And I worried that I was mimicking them, and I wanted to write this as responsibly as possible. And choosing figures who had written their own memoirs was one way I thought I could do this responsibly. The publisher was motivated by presenting children a truer picture of the British Empire. But in our conversations over who to include and how to include them, I saw that these persistent old tropes of empire remained. Because of Alexander's beautiful illustrations and the back and forth that happened between us as we readied the book for print, I can show you these illustrations to show you what I was talking about. This was a sketch for a spread about Captain Cook, Captain James Cook, that I was sent by Alexander. And the way that our process worked was that I sent my text to the editor. The editor wrote a kind of set of instructions for Alexander. Alexander produced a sketch that was sent to the editor and was then sent to me. Alexander and I have only ever spoken twice before. But when I received this image with the sketch, the editor wanted to know, was the flag on Captain Cook's boat right? Is that the flag that the British Navy would have been flying in the 1770s? This is the kind of detail that as a historian, I care nothing about. But for some people, especially with military history, it's people who are interested in military history, these things are important. But what I saw was that this image of Captain Cook arriving in Camay, Botany Bay in 1770 showed an empty beach. And that wasn't true of Cook's encounter in what became Australia. Cook's crew encountered two Guigal men, and they had a conflict, and one of the Guigal men was injured. And I knew that we couldn't present this encounter as if no one was there when Cook arrived, because the idea that Australia was empty became a rationale for British settlement of Australia. And so deciding which details were important in the images, what sort of stories they told became a huge part of the discussions between me and the editors as we figured out not only who to include in the book, but how to share their stories. And so a tremendous amount of research went into writing the stories themselves, but also the image research for the different spreads, because this is a visual history and the words in the image worked well together. And thinking about who to include and how to include them, I needed to draw on the research of scholars. And so I knew very early on, one of the figures I wanted to include was Tajoni Hokarawa, a Mohawk man who traveled with 3 other Mohawk and Mohican leaders to London in 1710 to engage in diplomacy with Queen Anne. I knew about Tajoni Hokarawa's story because of the work of a historian called Thrush, Indigenous London, which makes the case for showing that we shouldn't think of Indigenous people as confined to specific territories. They were also global actors. And so this is an image of Tajoni Hokarawa and his peers in London in Covent Garden. And I had 2 research assistants from Reed who helped me with the image research and drawing together all of these histories so that we could create these scenes to tell the story we thought needed to be told about Tajoni Hokarawa. And these the drafts of these sketches became these beautifully realized color images. And another part of our research for the project was not just looking for historical detail, but wanting to tell the fullness of these individual community and national histories, even though we were so limited in the word count for our picture. So to research Tajoni Hokarawa's story, I not only read histories of the 17th and 18th centuries, but I also read works like Audra Simpson's Mohawk Interruptus and Susan Hill's The Clay We Are Made Of to understand Haudenosaunee and Mohawk cosmologies, political theories, and philosophies. Even though that wasn't the focus of the spread, I wanted people to know that there was a larger world out there beyond the Mohawk encounter with the British Empire. Another back and forth we had, and thinking about how to bring historical specificity into the image, is present in this image of Te Rangi Topeora, who was one of the signers of the Treaty of Waitangi in 1840 in what is today Aotearoa, New Zealand. And the sketch that Alexander sent on the left, the top left, is the first image that I saw of this spread, and that shows Te Rangi Topeora looking at the treaty at Kapiti with missionary Henry Williams. After seeing this document or this first sketch, I felt that the figures that she were with felt a little bit generic or bland. And she signed the treaty with her uncle Te Rapohara and her son Matene Te Fifi, who were both important political leaders in their own right. And so we did image research to find images of her uncle and her son, so that detail could be incorporated into the image. So rather than presenting a kind of more generic figure, we were rooting these images in historical specificity. And in the final image, it was important for us to show real Maori rangatira, like I'm saying, but also with their mokos. There was some debate back and forth about whether or not we would include their facial tattoos. But this was an important part of Maori personhood and leadership, and so we wanted to show them with their mokos. Te Rangi Topeora met my editor's expectations for an Indigenous person's relationship to the British Empire. In a way, we can say she signed the treaty, but then she resisted. She wanted, she fought against the British government's definition of what the treaty actually meant. But for other figures, conveying Indigenous interests in particular became a major sticking point. And so one of the figures that kind of best represents how I had to educate my editors and think very carefully and responsibly about what stories to include and which histories to tell appears in the figure of Paia-Mataha. The editors wanted a Native North American figure who supported the 13 colonies during the American War of Independence. I resisted this framing of US independence because the American independence from the British Empire was devastating for Native North America. And most Native Americans supported the British in the conflict. They didn't do this because they were for the British Empire, that they were pro the British Empire. But the editor's request revealed that for them, each of these stories was captured in relationship to the empire. It was kind of flattened into how it was slotted into this imperial story. And I wanted to, again, refuse this idea that the only thing that mattered about any of these individual stories was the relationship to the British Empire. But how do we do that when the British Empire is the frame of the story? So the figure we decided on was Paia-Mataha, a Chickasaw leader who, rather than side with the British or the American colonists during the Revolution, chose to stay neutral. And this was important to show that Native American nations were fighting for their own sovereignty, whether or not they were aligned with the British or against them. And again, it was the importance of a historian like Kathleen Duval and her book, Independence Lost, that I was able to find Paia-Mataha's story and find a different way of sharing the history of Native North America in relationship to the British Empire. I wanted to just share a couple of more images from the book to show you this process of making the book. This is a sketch of William Cuffey, whose father was born enslaved in the Caribbean and found his way to freedom in London. And William Cuffey worked as a tailor, and he became the leader of the Chartist Rebellion in Britain, a campaign that fought for workers' rights, specifically the right to vote. William Cuffey was one of the leaders of a mass protest organization in 1848 that was called off. This made him very angry. And the illustrator, not really knowing the details of the story, I felt that he portrayed Cuffey as confused. And Cuffey, we know from his own words and the newspaper articles, was not confused. He knew very specifically what he wanted, and he was angry that the march didn't happen. And there's more I could say about this. You'll have to read the book to find out. But this was another point. What details mattered? And how does the image work with the text? And so we went back and forth, and we came up with the solution that Cuffey would support the speaker on the platform. Another way that the images and the text work together is that they're able to creatively imagine worlds that we don't have visual access to. So this is an image of Anna Mahace, who was the child of Indian indentured laborers in Trinidad. And she became a teacher and wrote a memoir. And her story in the book is a story of a more ordinary person and how they navigated the colonial situations that they found themselves in. But an illustration here can show us a picture of, again, a world that we don't have visual documentary image for. This is another one of my favorite images from the book. It's Olaudah Equiano, whose 1799 interesting narrative was a really important memoir in the campaign for abolition of the transatlantic slave trade. In the image, Equiano is shown writing his book in his study, but the painting behind him shows a ship at sea, and that's how he spent most of his life. So the artist can bring together these details of a person's life and show in one moment of time a longer trajectory of their life. This is George Manuel, and I knew from the beginning that I wanted him to be the final figure in the book, not only because of his work as a Secwepemc political leader and a leader of First Nations in Canada, but because of his work to create the World Council of Indigenous Peoples and to bring Indigenous struggles together in solidarity. And so I feel like Manuel's story really illustrates one of the hopes that I have for the book. Although these individuals are rooted in different times and places, perhaps there are ways to craft solidarities out of their different experiences and struggles. And here the image, which is because this campaign was in 1982, we have photos and videos of the Constitution Express, this campaign to shape the Canadian Constitution. The child and the stroller and the signs that the people in the image are carrying are real. They were real signs. But in this image, they kind of reinforce the story of Manuel's childhood and the way that he was taken from his family to a residential school. So the image and Manuel's story work together to think about this relationship between the past, the present of this image, and their future, which is our present. This is Munto. I'm not going to say more about this, but to me, this is an image that really conveys emotion, the emotion of saying goodbye at partition of a Muslim Indian who felt he had to leave India for Pakistan. I'm not going to talk about this because I want us to have a lot of time for question and answer, but ask me about the agents of empire. And so just to kind of conclude with the end of the book is really a way of thinking about the past and the way it serves us in the present. And sometimes as historians, we get bogged down in our archival research, but when writing for children, you have to be incredibly simple and clear about what stories matter and how to convey meaning succinctly. I hope my book will inspire conversations about the relationship between the history of the British Empire and the struggles against colonialism we see unfolding around us today. The book was just published yesterday in US and Canada. It'll be published tomorrow in the United Kingdom and Europe, and on November 7th in Australia and Aotearoa, New Zealand. It has a global audience that might also include India in the near future. And thinking about a global history that's rooted in the specific histories of individuals and communities is kind of what was my hope for this book. That by reading it, we might think about what unites us, even as we understand our particular struggles might be distinct. And so the book is out in the world, which means strangers on the internet are reviewing it. And that's been kind of bananas for me to experience. And there's an Instagram campaign underway with influencers and mommy bloggers, which really reminds me again that the books that children read are often chosen for them by adults, whether it's librarians, teachers, parents, family members. And experiencing this publicity campaign has made me aware again of what impact gatekeepers have on what books are made available for children. And I just want to kind of return to where I began today with the importance of libraries and schools. Despite the sale to individuals of books, it's libraries and schools that make up the majority of children's book sales, and they play an important role in what stories children have access to and what histories are available to them. And so I hope soon children will be reading my book with teachers and loved ones, and hopefully they'll be thinking about history, who gets to write it, whose voices matter, and the importance of the past for our present and the future. Thank you so much for speeding through my history of the British Empire with me. And now I'd love to hear your questions.
And there is a microphone at the back on that middle table there, if anyone at the back. And I've got a microphone here if anyone has.
Hi, given the current state of how certain political groups that are very active are in the process of absolutely just trying to whitewash all history, especially history that involves African Americans, because they're worried that feelings might get hurt, how do you plan to try to get this book past that one very specific group that seems to be causing most of the headache?
I wish I had a good answer for that, but I think that it's not something that one book can do, or one person. I believe that the book campaigns are coordinated, and it's people who are willing to take the time to think seriously about what books are in the school libraries, what books are in our public libraries, and how children might be receiving them. But what I think that my book can do is to raise a different set of questions and maybe change the way we think about how histories are told. And so I think that what you're alluding to is the idea that children shouldn't be made to feel uncomfortable by history. And I would just say that, discomfort, and Caitlin Greenridge actually wrote an amazing essay in Vogue magazine, I believe, about book bans. And I think that we need to recognize that discomfort, pain, grief are real emotions that children and adults need to process. And maybe history books that give us a variety of approaches to the past that contain within it a variety of histories might be one way of thinking about these multiple perspectives and how together they share a larger story. So I wish I had a better answer for you, but I think we all need to be aware that this is happening, and that, it's happening whether we do anything or not. So maybe we all need to start defending our libraries more.
Since the British Empire's huge story, how did you decide which biographies to focus on?
Yeah, that was a really, really difficult question. And I'd like to take a moment to go back to the slide that I didn't get to talk about. So when the book was started, there was going to be 25 biographies, profiles in the book, and they were going to include imperialists like Cook and Clive and Colston, as well as the voices of colonial subjects like Munto. After I submitted the draft of the book to the publisher, I didn't hear from them for 6 months. And what I found out was that they had been talking to internal stakeholders, which meant their publicity team. And they felt like the book that included the voices of imperialists, as well as those who kind of experienced empire as colonial subjects, was not marketable. And so they were concerned not only about the harm to children to hear the perspective of someone who, for instance, was responsible for enslavement, but also that it wouldn't be legible to the public and it wouldn't be marketable. So those are two factors that kind of shaped the book, and I think shapes kind of commercial publishing for children in general. And so I wanted to choose figures that came from around the British Empire that spanned a longer period of time. And I wasn't choosing people because I saw them as heroes, but rather I was choosing people because I felt like their story told us something about the larger dynamics of empire. And so in several of the, in all of the spreads, they're organized in a similar way. There's some basic kind of biographic information at the top left, time, place, but on the right, all of them have a context box. So it's trying to say, here's how this particular biography relates to a larger phenomenon in the British Empire. And so Munto, for instance, was a writer, and he was Muslim, born in colonial India. He was a writer, a screenwriter, a journalist. And after independence of India and Pakistan, there was violence against Muslims in India. He couldn't find work in Bollywood anymore. And he made the very hard decision that he had to leave India for Pakistan. And so for me, this story really shows a personal story of partition that we might not be familiar with. And it really shows the kind of personal sense of loss of partition. There are other ways that the story of partition could be told and should be told. But for this book, I felt like Munto's story, again, was a way of illustrating this larger phenomenon in the empire. And similarly, other stories illustrate these different kind of processes.
I was wondering if you might have any more details about your research that you did, about how to transfer your research into children's books. You talked about the authenticity that was required, if there was anything else that you really wanted to focus on as you transferred all of your historical background into the children's books.
Yeah, I mean, every story involved a great deal of research. And I had these two amazing research assistants, my students at Reed, who were helping me with this. And so, for instance, George Manuel's story, I told you, he wrote a book called The Fourth World, an Indian Reality, which I think is an amazing book that I would recommend to anyone. And so I could start with Manuel's own words and how he told his own story and what his commitments were. And that helped me understand what was important to him and what his motivations were. But then I read beyond that to history books. So the Constitution Express, so in Canada and the other settler colonies of the British Empire, they didn't receive independence officially and finally until the 1980s, when they wrote their own constitutions. And this happened in Canada in 1982. And when from the 1960s to the 1980s, the Canadian government had an assimilationist policy towards the First Nations. They wanted them to lose their status as a sovereign, and to be folded into the politics of Canada. And George Manuel's protested this at every step of this longer history of assimilation, political assimilation in Canada. And but there's a lot of scholarship about the Constitution Express. And so I was able to draw on that to think about what I wanted to focus on. But another thing that I knew I wanted to focus on was residential schools. And that is part of George Manuel's biography, but it's not necessarily the only thing that matters. But residential schools, especially in the summer that I was writing this book, were very much in the public attention. And so it felt like this was an opportunity to also include those details about his experience, because it was part of our public conversation today. So I would say there was looking for as much personal information about these figures as I could find. There was relying on historians and the scholarship they created, and then thinking about the resonances of these stories for our contemporary moment.
You don't have to answer if you don't want to, but was there something that you had to compromise on that stakeholders and publishers said absolutely not, and you were kind of a little sad that you couldn't, figure out a way to put it in the book?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I was talking earlier today with students in History 130, is it? About this question. And I would say there was just so much back and forth between me and the editors about a lot of different aspects of the book. And so I saw this as I was the expert in the history of the British Empire, and they were the experts on commercial children's publishing. And this book has really had to be meeting in the middle. And one of the things that was hard for me was when they cut, did I finish the story about the Agents of Empire? Okay, so they sorry, I don't know how I lost my train of thought with that one. So they decided after conversations with the internal stakeholders that they were going to cut the figures of the imperialists from the spread and from the personal spreads. So we wouldn't hear their voices in the book, but instead we gave summaries of them in the third person voice on like an introductory spread. And I, at the beginning of the process, was not sure about the inclusion of imperialists in the book. But I came around to it because I thought it was important that imperialism didn't seem like an abstract process that wasn't undertaken every day by individuals. And I felt like it was important to find a way to also include them in the story. But when we cut them out, what that meant was we not only lost the motivations of these individuals, but we lost background. We lost, like, again, each of these stories was chosen because they told us something about the empire. So Robert Clive, who was really foundational in the origins of British rule in India, by losing his story, it meant it put pressure on the story of Lakshmi Bai, Rani of Jhansi, for that page to tell the story of how the British came to be in India, in addition to having to tell the story about the rebellion of 1857. So I'm not answering your question with like a specific thing, but the entire process, it made me realize that I did have to compromise on what my ideal book would look like in order to get it published. And if I had at the beginning, they told me you have 20 stories, they're only going to be people whose voices have been overlooked in the history of empire, I might have made really different decisions. But because of the way the process unfolded, you know, we went forward with the people who we had started with.
Hi, I just always like to ask for book recommendations.
Oh,
so like if you could recommend one book, either, again, it can be children's, middle grade, high school, or nonfiction, or if you have multiple, but like, what do you think would help most to clarify these kinds of systemic inequities?
Whew. I did read a lot of histories written for children. And so we go all the way to the back of the beginning. Oh. I want to say one more thing about about these biography anthologies, which is a new genre, a popular genre now for children. There's like goodnight stories for rebel girls. There's so many books now that are being written for middle grade readers for this 9 to 12-year-old audience that are organized around telling a larger story through personal narratives. And the thing that I want to say about them is I think that these books are important because they do bring into visibility the stories of individuals and the histories of communities. But I also think that they're insufficient if they are only the kind of celebratory, heroic stories that don't also include why we need these books in the first place. And so I think that there aren't a lot of books actually that break out of either the frame of the nation. So the story is important because it's about inclusion and belonging and sort of the fight for rights within a national framework, or about identity. And so I don't have a recommendation, I'm really sorry, but I would just urge you all to keep thinking about what are the meta narratives in these history books for children? What is the sort of basis of belonging or affirmation or struggle? And, you know, can we do more with how we teach children about the past?
I have a question.
Yeah.
How much work was this? Like, and how was it similar or different from your work as a teacher, your work as a scholar, and other public work you've done, like the Imperialism of Syllabus?
Yeah, it was a lot of work. And commercial publishing has really intense deadlines. So, you know, I was sending batches of these biographies to my editor, and just trying to kind of struggle to get them in on top of my other commitments. And then, like I told you, I didn't hear from them for 6 months. And then I got feedback, and we had a new vision for the book. And I had a month to write like new introductory spreads, to revise all of the biographies, and it kept happening in the same way. You don't hear anything, and then it comes back so quickly, and you have to get it in. So that was one of the biggest challenges of the book, was like sticking to those deadlines. And I would say that this process is incredibly different from doing archival scholarly research. Because when historians do archival research, we're finding all of these like fragments of the past, and we're trying to piece them together into a story, and thinking about how that story we're seeing fits into what we think we know about the past. This process of writing this book felt a lot more like teaching, where I was synthesizing histories that existed and trying to distill what really mattered and so that I could convey it to the audience, the children, the children's who would be reading the book. And that's what, you know, as a teacher, I do in my classroom. We take the material that we read together, and I guide students to think about what matters, what the parts of any of the histories we read we should focus on, and again, why it's important for the larger historical narrative we're building in the class.
I was wondering how explicit you felt you needed to be in connecting these personal stories to just the overall engine of the British Empire, and if there was ever any fear that a child might read it and just kind of miss the point.
I mean, I think that as an author, you do your best to convey what you're doing as clearly as you can, but ultimately what readers take away from the book will be their own version of what you've written. And I think that you have to be okay with that. And you can guide the reader as much as possible, which is why there's all that kind of explanatory material. But ultimately, you know, whoever reads this book will take something away from it, and it will lead them in different directions. And I think that's great. I think that's why we read, and that's why we write too, to see where what we're doing will go. I have to say though, like, you know, again, I'm a scholar. A lot of people don't read my work. Seeing the Goodreads reviews come in has been very trippy. But I wanted to show you one in particular. So it's very nice. Some of them have been very positive. Some of them are a little indifferent. That's okay too. But this one I thought was so interesting. This person was incredibly upset by the Agents of Empire spread. And they felt that in the story about Colston, the little paragraph about Colston, the one who had been a board member of the Royal African Company, that we had kind of presented this information factually about what he had done. And she, or I don't know, they felt that we hadn't done sort of enough exposition around it. But the last take of the line was, I, however, greatly despise the agents of empire. The book elicited such a strong emotional response. And in a way, that's the best thing that I could hope for, that we are presenting the historical record in a way that readers are engaging with and thinking about and coming to terms with. And so we'll see where the book goes, but I don't know. Even though Lise Giselle was sort of, wanting something more or different, in a way, what I had intended in the book to come across had.
Oh, we'll probably have time for one or two more questions.
Hi. You talked a little bit about feeling some reluctance to accept the project, in part because of how it might be kind of perceived, I guess, by historians and whether it would be taken seriously, I guess. I was just wondering if you could talk a little bit more about that feeling and if you've had any experiences so far writing the book or since it came out yesterday. Just if those kind of concerns have been realized or if you've had a different experience.
Yeah, I mean, I think that for those of you who are familiar, for historians, writing an academic monograph is sort of the standard of what we do. So a scholarly press, deep archival research, peer-reviewed, that is kind of how we establish ourselves as historians who know what we're doing. And this is not that. And so I did have apprehensions when I started this project of how my peers would perceive it. And I have to say that I have been overwhelmed with the support of historians for this project. Historians ask me, how did this happen? Or how did this opportunity come about? They want to know like what my experiences have been about, and they want to know what the reception is. In some ways, the people in my field understand more deeply what I'm trying to do in sharing a history of the British Empire that looks like this. Like they see the reflection of the scholarship that they know being translated to a wider audience. I actually think it is that wider audience. I mean, that's who it's for. It's a book for children. It's not a book for academic historians. But I wonder about what space there is in the marketplace of children's literature for a book like this. So for instance, I called Changing Hands Bookstore, which is, a big bookstore here in Phoenix. And I asked if they had copies of my book in the store. And the answer was no. They have them and you can buy them on their website online, but they don't have them in the store. The same is true at Powell's, which is the big bookstore in Portland where I live. So I just wonder, given the context or the other types of titles that are published in children's history in the US, like how this book will be received or how it's understood. So we'll have to see. Yeah.
So last time, but yeah.
Well, it's a lot of pressure for the last question. If you had the opportunity to rewrite this book for an older audience, would you take that?
For an older audience, you mean adults?
Yes.
Yeah. Yeah. I think I have been thinking more and more. I have written a monograph. It's coming out with Oxford University Press, so like a legitimate, academic publisher. I am also a serious historian, but I'm really interested in thinking about writing for the public, because in a way, what historians know of our field and of the past is not making its way into public conversations. And I think that it's actually more important than ever that historians engage with the public about how we think the past should be narrated. So I'm the imperialism syllabus, which is on public books, you can go check it out. It is actually under contract to become a book, which will be an introduction to imperialism. I think having the chance to write a more public facing book about the British Empire would be really exciting. Yeah.
Kia ora, Radhika, and coming and could we thank Radhika once again?
Thank you all for coming to my book party. Yes, yes.